If you would please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. So we're going to look this morning at the story of the calling of Samuel. We're going to dig in a little bit, not really verse by verse, but we're going to pick out a few verses to look at a little bit more closely. But before we get to the story that was read this morning, I want to give you just a little bit of background on what's going on when this calling of Samuel, when this... Okay, I'm going to teach you a seminary word. Are you ready? I don't know. Nan doesn't know. Does anyone else not know? Okay, this is a word you can use in Scrabble. Get you, well, if you get a triple word score, it'll do really well for you. Okay, are you ready? Theophany. Can you say it back?
Theophany.
Theophany. Theophany. That means God showed up. God revealed God's self. God was there with the person that's relating the story. So Samuel's story is a theophany. It's a very dramatic event where Samuel is face to face with God. But I want to give you a little bit of an idea of the background. What's going on behind the scenes in Israel? What happened leading up to this story? Because it's very important, I think, to understand what's going on in Israel for us to understand how significant Samuel's calling is. So, who knows the story of Hannah? This is a Sunday school favorite. A lot of us have heard the story of Hannah, who goes with her husband to worship at the tabernacle, to give sacrifice and offering to God. And in the time of the Israelites in this ancient time, it was very common for men to have more than one wife. And so Hannah was one of her husband's wives, but there was another wife. And as it turns out, Hannah wasn't able to bear children, and the other wife was just having kids left and right. And so Hannah, when her family came to worship at the house of God, was distraught. She wasn't able to do what she felt she was supposed to do as a wife. She didn't feel like she was able to do what was expected of her, and so she felt like she was less worthy of a person. And of course her husband did some things to try to cheer her up, but she showed up at the house of the Lord really, really desiring that God would grant her one request, and that request was that he would give her a child. And so Hannah at the temple is praying so fervently. And the other thing to remember here is in this time period, it's not something that's easy for us to understand, because I don't think we would ever think of judging someone because they weren't able to have children. But in that time, if you were a woman who was unable to have children, there was a social stigma that went along with the fact that you were, as the words used in the Bible sometimes, barren. And so she's praying desperately because she's experienced this social stigma. She's experienced this sense of unworthiness because of her physical condition. And so she's praying so fervently, she doesn't even notice what's going on around her. She doesn't even notice what's happening around her. She doesn't notice that Eli, the priest, the main guy, is standing next to her. And she's praying so fervently that she's mouthing the words, but no sound is coming out. And Eli, in just one of the most terrible examples, or one of the best examples I can think of terrible pastoral care, comes up to this woman who's clearly in pain and accuses her of being drunk because he doesn't understand why her lips are moving and she's not talking. She seems like she's kind of babbling under her breath. And he accuses her of being drunk. And she says, "No, sir, I assure you that I am not drunk. In fact, I'm praying." And she tells tells Eli what she's praying for. And the upshot is, she kind of makes a deal with God. She says, "God, you give me a son. I will bring him here to your house and dedicate him to your service." So before Samuel's even conceived, there's sort of this understanding that God has a special claim on Samuel's life. And so as it turns out, Hannah does have a child. She names him Samuel. And when he is no longer nursing, she takes him to God's house and presents him to Eli and says, I'm giving this boy back to God. So that's how Samuel ends up living in God's house with Eli. Now, Eli, we've already kind of seen that he's not like maybe the best pastor ever. You know, this guy that kind of comes up to folk and says, hey, are you drunk? That'd be like me going over to Nan and saying, Nan, are you drunk here in church? That's pretty ridiculous, right? Nan says, well, I wasn't. Just not the kind of thing, you know, a conscientious person really does. Well, it turns out that Eli's sons were so much worse than Eli. Eli's sons were also priests. They also were serving in God's house. But it turns out they kind of saw serving in God's house as like their personal Disneyland. They saw being ministers of God as being kind of like a license to take anything they wanted. And so there were some rules. The way that ministers were paid in these days was that when people brought their lambs or their calves or their cows or their goats for sacrifice, some of that animal was used for the sacrifice and burned completely, and some was boiled and given to the priests so that they would be able to eat and to be sustained in their ministry. That was the sort of like the deal. You were a priest of God. The way you were able to make a living was by having a portion of what was given to God. And there were some rules governing how that worked. And there's a really kind of weird rule that goes along with how the priests were supposed to take the boiled meat for themselves. They had this like big fork, a pitchfork looking thing, a 3-pronged fork. And while the meat was boiling, the priest was supposed to take this big fork and jam it in the pot, kind of like without looking. And then pull it out, and whatever was on the fork, that's what the priest could take. So it was kind of this idea that God's doing the providing. You put the fork in, you get back what God wants you to have. Well, Eli's sons were not comfortable with this arrangement. In fact, they were so uncomfortable with it, they decided not to do it. And so what they would do is they would go to the people giving their offerings and they'd say, give me that now. Before it had finished being completely offered to God, they were cutting off, I don't know anything about butchering, but I guess they're cutting off like sides of beef or something and taking it away with them. They were taking the best parts. They were picking and choosing what they wanted to have, not waiting for God to provide for them. The Lord did not appreciate this. They were also doing something way worse. There were women that were around the temple area that served as gatekeepers and did some other duties in the temple area. And Eli's sons also considered these women to be their personal property and their playthings, so to speak. The priests, Eli's sons, were using their office, abusing their office, for their own personal satisfaction. Whatever they wanted, they took. The Lord was not pleased with this. That's a little bit of the background of what's going on, how Samuel got to the house of God, and what's going on in the house of God. Has anyone ever seen the television program, I think it's on Netflix, House of Cards? A couple people have seen it. Well, that's all about politics, and it's about people doing like backroom deals and corruption in politics in Washington, D.C. Well, you could call this program that I'm talking about House of God, and it's all about these priests doing things behind the scenes that are not good, that are not what is what a priest ought to be doing, and making the house of God into something it's not supposed to be, making it into a mockery. Basically, they're offending the presence of God. That's what's going on behind the scenes. So let's get to the story now. In the first verse The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. That's great. Things are looking good. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare, and there were not many visions. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare, and there were not many visions. Israel had come out of bondage, led by Yahweh himself. They were led across the Red Sea. Remember, we've talked about the story of the Red Sea. Yahweh fights the battle against the Egyptians and makes the way through the Red Sea for the Israelites to continue in safety. Yahweh continues as a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire, showing the way to the promised land. The Israelites, under the instruction and leadership of Moses, build this tabernacle and this Ark of the Covenant that are representative of God's presence among the people. And it's this very tabernacle, this tent, that was built during the Exodus, this very same Ark of the Covenant, this holy chest that was built during the Exodus, that Eli and Samuel are living in and living with. Eli and Samuel are living with the very presence of God, the tabernacle, the holy Ark of the Covenant, these things that represent and signify that God is present, except that the word of the Lord was rare, this story tells us. And there weren't very many visions. The people of Israel were living with the artifacts of faith, but they seem to have lost the reality of faith. They were living with the artifacts of God's presence, but they were no longer experiencing the power of God's presence, the reality of God's presence. They no longer knew this God who had personally delivered them out of slavery, that had personally fought the battle with the Egyptians, that set them free at the Red Sea, that had personally led them across the desert into the promised land. This Yahweh, this God, with whom Israel had had a special and very particular relationship, had been reduced to just an idea. God had gone from being a relationship, a relational being, a person with whom it was possible to be in covenant and communion with. God had gone from that being, that person, to kind of a holy idea, a nice thing to think about. And so the people of Israel were going through the motions of religion. They were surrounded by the artifacts of religion. But the word of the Lord was rare. God, it seems, was no longer revealing God's self the way God had been revealed throughout the history of the Israelites. God had gone from being a person to being an idea. In verse 2, we get this picture of the scene where God will reveal God's self to Samuel. And the scene is that Eli is ready to go to bed, but I want to point something out that's very interesting. I told you how bad Eli's sons were. And it says here that Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was ready to lie down for bed. I think that the writer here is giving us a clue to Eli's condition. It wasn't just physical blindness that plagued Eli. He was spiritually blind as well. He was blind to what his sons were doing in abuse of their priestly office. He was blind to what needed to be done to get Israel back in right relationship with God. The priest, the one who should have been closest to God's presence, who should have been most able to see clearly what God's will and plan was for God's people, was becoming so blind he was barely able to see anything at all. But verse 3 is a note of hope. The lamp of the Lord had not yet gone out. There's still something the writer of this story seems to be telling us there's still something that has a spark left in it. There's just a little light left. And that light, we're going to find out, is the light of God's calling to Samuel. It says that Eli and Samuel were lying down in the tabernacle, in God's holy house. And that Samuel was actually lying in proximity. He was lying adjacent to the Ark of the Covenant. He was at the very doorway of the Holy of Holies, this place that was the very dwelling of God. Samuel was sleeping at the threshold, sleeping at the threshold of the presence of God. Samuel. Samuel. Samuel starts awake. He didn't recognize the voice, so he assumed it must be Eli needing something. And so he runs to Eli's room. I didn't call you, Eli says to Samuel. Go back and go to sleep. I would imagine there's a little annoyance in Eli's voice at this point. And so Samuel goes back to his little cot, his little bedroll at the threshold of the Holy of Holies. Lies down again. Samuel! Samuel! Samuel jumps up, runs once again to Eli and says, I'm here, I'm here. What can I do for you? I didn't call you. The annoyance is getting a little bit more acute at this point. You don't wake a blind old man up every 5 minutes. Go back to bed, Samuel. Samuel goes and takes his position once again, lies down at the threshold of the Holy of Holies. Samuel! 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 Up he starts, he runs in to Eli's sleeping area and he says, Eli, I'm here, what can I do? Eli's first instinct is to be extremely annoyed. What are you doing in here? I didn't call you. Wait a second. After the third time, it finally dawns. It dawns on Eli that maybe there's something else going on here. We are, after all, in God's house. And so Eli says to Samuel, Yahweh is trying to get a hold of you. It's the Lord who is speaking to you. Go back, and when you hear the voice again, say, Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And this is where we get the theophany. The story says, once again, the Lord came. And he stood there and said, Samuel, Samuel. Now, I want to try to get an idea of what an important event this is. Sometimes the words on the page seem so just mundane. They seem so everyday. God stood there and said, Hey, Samuel. But imagine that you are living in a culture that still kind of looks like it believes in God, that still has some of the trappings of religion attached to it, but where everyone is pretty much just either going through the motions or has completely abandoned the principles of faith in God altogether. Where people are more or less kind of doing what they want and living as functional atheists. Living as if God doesn't exist, even though the trappings of religion, the artifacts of faith surround them. Everyone is living as if there is no God at all. Samuel, one of the few people, I kind of think, Laura, you might appreciate this, I kind of think of Samuel like our situation. He's, learning what it means to be a minister. He's in seminary, is what I'm saying. He's apprenticed to Eli. He's learning about God. He's learning what it means to be a servant of God. He's learning about the facts of theology, why we say what we say about God, why we do what we do in worship. He's kind of getting all these things down pat. He's learning about God, yet he's not experienced God for himself. He understands intellectually, but there's nothing in the culture around him, there's nothing in his own personal experience that ratifies what he believes and knows to be true. Yes, his mother had a miraculous experience in praying for a child and then giving birth to Samuel, but Samuel's own experience is one that is removed. He's not experienced God for himself, even though he is serving God and ministering before the Lord. He's living in a culture that kind of wants nothing to do with God. It's surrounded itself with the trappings of religion, but has forgotten about the power of God's presence. There are reminders of God's presence everywhere, but the power of God's presence is departed. And so it's in this atmosphere that God stands face to face with Samuel. The Lord stands there, personally calls to Samuel. And Samuel's response is, "Speak, Lord. Your servant is listening." God reveals God's self to Samuel in an intimate and personal way and gives him the grace to say, "Speak, your servant is listening." I don't know about you, but when I read this story, it really resonates with me. I mean, I feel like I live in a culture that is sort of defined by faith in God, particularly by Christian faith in God. But the power of God's presence is hard to come by. Most of us order our lives around Sunday being the Lord's Day. A lot of people set aside Wednesday as another day of worship. We kind of organize our existence around these trappings of religion. A lot of us say a brief grace before we eat. A lot of us say a prayer before we go to sleep. A lot of us spend time reading the Bible. And a lot of us do all of those things and still kind of live like God doesn't exist. We sometimes forget to believe in God. We get so involved in the day-to-day routine of what we're trying to accomplish. Even those of us that are trying to accomplish things for God sometimes forget to believe in God. And we think it's all about our effort and our strength and our ability. I'm going to preach a great sermon today, I might tell myself, because I studied hard. And I read the Greek, and I looked at all the commentaries, and I've got all of the facts and information that I need. But at the end of the day, at the end of the sermon, if God didn't show up, then it's a failure. We can plan the best program of outreach that has ever been conceived. We can have an unlimited budget. We can be able to feed every child in Blount County with unlimited money. I said Blount County, that's where I used to live. This is Cobb County. Any county. But if we're doing it in our own strength, we're going to find ourselves always struggling, always running up against a brick wall, always wondering, why can't I seem to take that next step I need to take? I've got the plan, I've got the budget, I've got the energy. What's missing? What's missing is we forgot to believe in God. And so even those of us who claim that God is real sometimes miss out on the blessing of God's presence because we think that we can kind of drum it up. We think that we can invoke God upon something. We think that because we've done the homework, that that's all that needs to be done. Samuel was doing the work. He was learning everything he needed to learn, but he still needed to experience God's presence, God's personal revelation of God's self, in order to become fully empowered to do the ministry that God had called him to do. It took blind old Eli 3 times, but he at least did finally get it. It took him 3 times to realize something extraordinary is happening here. God is revealing something in these moments. We have to take into consideration that whatever we set out to do has to be bathed in prayer. It has to be 100% acknowledging that we can't do it on our own. We can make all the plans in the world, but if God isn't in them, we're going to come up short. And while most of the time we don't hear voices, and most of the time if we do hear voices, someone might be trying to lock us up, we can still experience the power of God's presence. We can still recognize that it's not our own strength, but God's blessing that makes the difference in what we set out to accomplish. God doesn't always reveal God's self in burning bushes and pillars of cloud and pillars of fire, or even in voices in the night. Martin Luther King Jr., who we celebrate, by the way, tomorrow is Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So I was thinking about Dr. King a little bit this weekend, and I looked up his call story. That's if you're in seminary, Laura, you can identify with this. How many times have you told your call story? At least 20, 25 times. When you're in seminary and you're in this process of moving forward into work in the church, you tell this story over and over again. People want to know, how did you come to be where you are? How did you know God put you on this path? How do you experience God's call on your life? Dr. King had been asked this, and so he wrote it down. And he said that he had always felt an urge in his deepest heart to serve God and to serve humanity. And he thought to himself, okay, I'm going to go be a lawyer. So he went and tried to be a lawyer. And it didn't feel right. He kept running up against some sort of block. But he knew he was supposed to serve God and serve humanity. And so he decided, I'm going to be a doctor. And he started studying pre-med. And it didn't feel right. Something wasn't right about that scenario either, but he knew he was supposed to serve God and serve humanity. Dr. King specifically says, I don't have a call story that's particularly dramatic or spectacular. I just had the urge to serve God and to serve others. So I tried to be a lawyer and I tried to be a doctor. But then something finally clicked. And he said, I knew that I couldn't do what I was supposed to do if I didn't serve God and I didn't serve others in the church. It wasn't the voice of God thundering out of the heavens. It was a final surrender. He even terms it as kind of a giving in to God's particular task. Nothing wrong with being a lawyer. Nothing wrong with being a doctor. Those are wonderful vocations that serve God and serve others. No doubt about it. But the particular call on Martin's life was to serve God and serve others in the church. And it wasn't until he finished trying to do these things on his own, and he pushed that aside and surrendered to God's particular call in his life, that he found peace. My call story is similar. Not particularly dramatic or spectacular. I just kind of always knew that God wanted me to serve in his church. I particularly knew God wanted me to serve at the altar. I had that sense of vocation, that sense of calling. And I was not interested in the least. I wanted to do things my way. I didn't particularly want anyone, including God, telling me how to run my life. And so I went to college and I tried this career path and I tried that career path, and I had some success in what I did, but nothing ever felt right. It wasn't until I was finally able to give up my idea of what my life should be like and accept what God had for me. What I'm trying to say is I had to finally figure out that I believed in God. Because if we believe in God, it means that we don't have to do things on our own and figure things out on our own. We can walk in faithfulness, following God, and expect that we will experience God's blessing. So even though you might not tonight in your bed be woken up by a voice saying, hey, I've got a job for you, I invite you to examine your heart and to give up those things which are keeping you from fully experiencing God's presence and the power of God's presence in your life. Stop trying to figure things out on your own. This is something that I have to remind myself of constantly. Because my tendency, and all of our tendency, is to just power on in our own strength and break down every barrier we can find to get to what we want. But at the end of the day, it has to be God's blessing. At the end of the day, we have to believe in God. We can't confess that there is a God and then live like God doesn't exist. That doesn't mean that we're living in sin. It just means that we're living in our own strength and not trusting in the power that God's given us. So let us all together, as we go through our lives, remember Samuel's story and be very careful to listen deeply to what God is saying to us in the world today. And let us answer with Samuel's words. Speak, Lord. Your servant is listening. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.